We're here with Sjoerd Duiker at Penn State at the research farm here. Sjoerd is a researcher over here at Penn State. You also teach, is that correct?
I teach some, yeah.
You
Not
teach
very much. I'm an extension specialist, so most
Okay.
of my work is with practitioners,
Okay.
people
so-
who work in the field.
Okay, very good. Sjoerd, this is big dairy country over here. So that's, you know, we've got the creamery and things like that here. And you do some very special work in the dairy industry. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I'm the soil management specialist here at Penn State, and my responsibilities are to help the farmers adopt or improved methods of soil management.
Okay.
So with dairy, you have some special opportunities because the dairy farmers, they can use the whole plant. They don't only have to use the grain or the
Right.
vegetables.
Okay.
So in my work, I have concentrated on helping farmers adopt no-tillage systems, continuous no-tillage, and diversify their crop rotations, and also to fill any fallow periods in the crop rotation with living vegetation, so that our principles, our guiding philosophy is basically to have a living vegetation and living root systems in the soil 365 days a year, continuously.
Okay. Well, that sounds kind of just about everything that soil health is about.
Yeah.
What are the underlying scientific principles that drive that philosophy?
Well, so if you don't do any tillage, you
Yes.
rely completely on natural processes in the soil to generate porosity, to create aggregate stability.
Yes.
For infiltration, you rely on just natural processes. So you try to use the vegetation, the crops that you work with, the cover crops or the commercial crops, to keep that soil alive, to keep that soil functioning. And it is a dynamic process, so you have to always continue working on it. Nature doesn't sit still ever. So you try to use the root systems, the above ground vegetation, to stimulate biological activity in the soil. You use root architecture. We have fibrous root systems.
Yes.
And research has shown that those are very important for aggregate stability. Root systems themselves, so the
Yes.
fibrous roots, they are entangling like the soil particles,
Yes.
and help them to create little aggregates. And
And
those
is it
aggregates,
just the roots, or is there something else
No.
going on there?
no, they're not only the roots,
Right.
it's also the mycorrhizae that are associated with those roots. So those are fungal hyphae
Yes.
that come out of the root. Basically, they grow into the root cells, but they come out, and then basically an extension of that root system. They're invisible to the eye, basically.
So these
we
are
cannot
other
really see them.
microorganisms that are actually living in a symbiotic relationship
Right.
with the plant.
Yes.
Okay.
And they also create those nets around. It's like I like to talk about them as nets.
Yes.
To catch those small particles and to make them into units. And then also there are the roots, they push out exudates, and those
Okay.
exudates, like polysaccharides, for example, they are very, they don't live very long. They are
Yes.
not long lasting,
Yes.
but they are also important as glues
Yes.
to stimulate soil aggregation as well.
Do the polysaccharides and exudates, do those attract microbes then as well?
Yeah, so there's a lot of activity in that rhizosphere right next to that root. There are, like, for example, amoeba
Yes.
that that go up and down along that route,
Yes.
and that is their space, their habitat,
Yes.
where they live, and it's especially along very small space along those routes.
Yes. But basically, then keeping that live root in the ground, really, your rhizosphere biological activity then is much higher, what you're saying,
Yes.
than the biological activity out of the rhizosphere. So that's one of the reasons that you'd want to keep that live root in the soil as well.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Just another question. I've heard somebody talk about carbon, you know, being these root exudates that they're sending out, and it's carbon. It's basically energy that feeds other microbes. Is that correct?
Yes. It is very challenging to measure it because it is very labile.
Okay.
So very few studies have actually documented how much carbon is actually pushed out of the roots into the soil.
Okay.
But I read some estimates, it might be 40% of all the carbon that the plant assimilates
Through
might actually,
photosynthesis.
actually be pushed out of the roots in exudates.
Okay.
But they don't live very long. They are consumed by the living organisms in the soil.
Okay.
So we don't have a pool that is growing and that we can measure easily.
Okay.
It's a constant process.
So that's another sort of frontier of science that we're going
Yes.
to have to find.
Right.
We know NPK quite well, at least
Yes.
organically, but this carbon thing is a whole different thing to measure. Is that correct?
Yes, it's very different.
Yeah.
But even NPK, I think our understanding can improve also there.
In the natural systems.
Yes, so we have focused very much on the water-soluble, readily available portions, a fraction of the nutrient pool,
Yes.
like nitrogen or phosphorus, potassium.
Yes.
We have tests that then, of course, we have to take into account the pool, for example, of phosphorus, because only a very small portion of the phosphorus is actually available to plants at any one time.
Correct.
So
the rest
we
is tied up in the minerals.
yes, minerals and organic fractions.
Okay.
Yes. So we have tests, but I think we are looking at still a fairly poor understanding of all those processes, how that is made available. Nitrogen especially, we basically assume all the nitrogen that the plants can take up is water soluble, but even there we don't quite understand everything.
So when I think it was Leonardo da Vinci said that we understand more about the stars than we understand about the soils. That sounds...
That still has not changed very much, perhaps.
Well, I kind of diverted you off your work there, but
Yeah.
going back to your studies, you also said you were looking at nutrient uptake.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit, you were talking about nutrient uptake from your cover crops versus nutrient uptake, I guess, from manure spread on fallow fields. Is that correct? Tell us a little bit more
Yes.
about that.
So, you know, in Pennsylvania, a special characteristic of our state is that we are very heavily reliant on the dairy sector.
Yes.
And our farms, they spread manure, and sometimes they spread it at times when there might not be living vegetation in the field. So
Okay.
the water-soluble portion of the nutrients can easily be lost. And we, being a large part of our state is in the Chesapeake Bay watershed,
Yes.
so we are under scrutiny. There's a lot of concern about nutrient losses to the rivers, to the streams, and eventually to the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And then what we are finding is that there are basically two periods during the year that we lose a lot of nutrients, where the big peaks are of nutrient loss to the water.
Yes.
One is in the fall, there's a little peak, and then most of the, especially nitrogen loss, occurs in the spring, just around May. That time, April, May, when we come out of the winter, the soil starts to thaw. There is a lot of water, the soil saturated, and now we get leaching through the soil profile, and mineralization is taking place. Nitrogen is just lost. A lot of nitrogen is then lost to groundwater, and that eventually then through lateral flow ends up in the streams.
Okay. And so that nitrogen has converted from an organic form or ammonia to nitrates, is that correct?
Much of it, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So, so the spring peak is mainly the warming up, the mineralization, and then leaching from that saturated soil. What about the fall peak?
Basically, also similar, also mineralization.
Yes.
But also our farmers are spreading manure throughout the winter too.
Okay, so
when
this
they
has
can.
also got an operational component.
Yeah, there's also, so there are nutrients added to that system. It's not only what is there in the soil.
Yes.
There are added components, and those are then very liable to loss.
Got it.
So what we are trying to do is to have living crops in the field at that moment, cover crops that take up all those nutrients and absorb them in their vegetation and protect those nutrients from being lost. So while there is mineralization taking place, the water-soluble nutrients, nitrogen primarily, is made available, and it's then absorbed by the roots. It's like a sponge, a continuous sponge that is there to take up those nutrients. And then what we have been doing is to evaluate the nutrients content in the cover crops, in the above ground biomass. That is what we have emphasized for now. We evaluate the cover crops for their uptake of nitrogen and phosphorus and also other nutrients. But those two are primarily what we focus on for now, because the sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus are the ones that are the focus of the water quality concerns.
Okay, so this is not only a concern for farmers, but it's a huge environmental concern.
Yes.
Because of the watershed situation you're in.
Right.
Okay.
So we have evaluated the nutrient uptake, and what we can find in the above ground biomass. Depending on growing conditions and the type of cover crop, but it can be even 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre.
Okay.
So what we are normally considering when we grow a full corn crop, we might assume that that corn crop needs 150 pounds of nitrogen, perhaps 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. We are talking about that kind of nutrient uptake by the cover crop and into the into the above ground vegetation only. So that makes up typically perhaps 80% of the total plant biomass. Okay. The rest is underground.
So you're actually just measuring the above ground biomass.
Yes.
Okay, so there's more underground. Okay.
More underground.
Okay. Yes.
So all that would otherwise have been liable to loss. So we are trying to really stimulate that cycling of those nutrients and avoiding them from being lost from the system.
Do you have any idea, are you able to give me at least a range of percentages of how much, in a sense, more efficient a cover crop is in holding the nutrients in the soil then? In this situation? Is that a fair question?
So we are looking at basically comparing a fallow system where there is no living vegetation with a situation where we have a cover crop.
Right.
So basically we assume that most of that would otherwise be lost. Whatever is in that, especially in the above ground vegetation, much of that would otherwise have been lost to groundwater. Yes.
Okay, so you're
I would say 80 to 100%.
80 to 100%, and that's mainly the nitrogen.
That's
and
nitrogen.
The nitrogen.
Now,
yeah.
phosphorus is a different animal
Yeah,
because it gets absorbed to the soil. So unless it leaches through preferential flow to groundwater, which in our soils is not a very predominant pathway, or it is lost through runoff over the soil surface, usually attached to soil particles, or in soluble form, the phosphorus basically stays in the soil.
Okay.
Yeah,
So these cover crops are really recovering close to 80, 90, 100% of the nutrients that would have otherwise have been lost through nitrification or even denitrification, I guess.
Yeah, so denitrification, we are emphasizing mostly the leaching component,
okay.
yes.
Okay.
It's a nitrogen that I'm talking about when I mentioned those high.
Correct, yes. So, okay, well tell me what this means for the farmer. I mean, okay, so we've got it in the cover crop. Does that mean anything for the farmer?
So we are very interested in assisting the farmers to adopt these practices.
Yes.
And I like to find ways to stimulate the farmers so that the farmers are motivated themselves to adopt the practices instead of the government having to come in and having to give them money, subsidies to do the practices, or by the government coming in and saying, if you don't do this, we are going to give you a fine.
Okay.
So I have a project that is actually called Without Carrot or Stick, because we are trying to stimulate the farmers to adopt cover crops without a carrot of subsidies, without a stick of regulations.
Yes.
So what we have found that is a very important component of our work is also the forage value of the cover crops. Because our farmers are dairy farmers, most of them, they can use even some of that cover crop as forage.
Yes.
And we find it a very well justified use of the forage, because basically they are cycling more nutrients on their own farm.
Yes.
It's going through the animal.
Yes.
They're producing some product, they're producing manure, the manure goes back on the field. Instead of them buying feed from outside, bringing nutrients from outside, from basically the Midwest usually in our world, that is one of the underlying big causes of our nutrient problems is the importation of nutrients from other parts of the country, from other parts of the world to our state. Because in the feed we bring nutrients that are not then all exported back to the Midwest or wherever that feed came from. So if we can produce more feed on our own farms and cycle more nutrients on our own farms, it is very beneficial.
Okay. So you're growing your nutrients by harvesting sunlight, at least the carbon and the nitrogen part, and the phosphorus and potassium and micronutrients are already in place.
So, so we have seen a huge interest amongst our farmers in using the cover crops for forage value. Yeah, we are so we have a project with 10. Usually we have 10 dairy farmers all over Pennsylvania.
This is your carrot and stick
That is my carrot and stick project.
Okay.
And it is all focused on cover crops after corn silage. We find that to be the most easiest place where we can actually include cover crops in our cropping systems, and also the highest pay or the highest bang for our buck basically application as far as environmentally, and also because farmers who grow corn silage are dairy farmers, they also there is a good window for planting the cover crops, and there is a good also opportunity for using the cover crops for forage.
Okay.
So we can use those different things. We think we would like to see every acre of corn silage in the state be followed with cover crops. No more fallow after corn silage. And we have seen, I've worked with a scientist from U.S. Geological Service He's a specialist in GIS and remote sensing, and we're using remote sensing imagery to evaluate the adoption of cover crops. And we've seen a significant increase in the last 3 years of adoption of cover crops this was in the counties that we were able to get imagery from in more the southern part of the state.
How does that make you feel?
Yeah, that is very satisfying. We've already seen an enormous increase in the adoption of no-tillage. When I came to Penn State in 2000, the percentage of no-tillage was about 20% of our crop acres, the planted acres. And now it is hovering about 55%, 60%.
That's fantastic.
And so that was the first big change that we have seen, but now we want to really emphasize, as part of that no-till system, we need to fill all those fallow periods with living crops. And so the cover crops are a big part of that, and we see that now our farmers are actually starting to use those practices. So we think it will be very beneficial for soil quality, for nutrient management, for nutrient cycling. And the farmers are intensifying their production, so we hope they can produce more forage on their own farm to cycle more nutrients on their own farm.
Are there any particular farmers that have made money through this, improved their profit margin? What's
Yes.
the economic effect on those farmers who have adopted this process?
Well, I cannot give you, I did not do an actual analysis, but I know that farmers have testified to me how it has impacted their operation. For example, I was working with a large dairy farmer here near State College. He was using some no-tillage, but he was always having trouble with it because he had a lot of compaction. He has a big manure spreader.
Yep.
And they spread manure, and sometimes the soil is somewhat moist and they compact it. And he was having a lot of trouble, he thought, with compaction. So he was chisel plowing now and then to alleviate that. But he told me that when he started using a cover crop,
Yes.
and letting that cover crop grow, put on growth, he got his compaction problem disappeared. The roots of the cover crop were actually, one was protecting the soil, making the soil more resilient to compaction effects, and on the other hand, the living root system also was alleviating compaction. So now he is using no-tillage continuously. He doesn't use tillage anymore. He told me he believes his yields are better now. And he doesn't have to do all the expense of doing the tillage, fuel, the wear and tear on his equipment. So, and then he can be more timely because everything takes less time.
Yeah.
So all those things together is a package that makes a big difference for the farmers at the farm scale.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose a farmer like that is an extension specialist's dream because he does more selling than you do eventually.
Oh
Is
yes,
that correct?
yes. The farmers are the best. They have to be the spokesman. That is why we work with the farmers in our project,
Yes.
and we put. We want the farmers. We have field days in the fall and in the spring,
Yes.
and we really like to have the farmers there, and mostly they have been participating. We also have asked them to try out some new cover crops on their own. We do some evaluations of some different crop mixtures in small plots, but then also we ask them to, on a bigger scale, like 10 acres, to try something that they had not tried before,
Okay.
and then they can talk about that with their colleagues.
Okay.
And they are the best. I mean, the farmers are not going to believe me when I talk. I can just talk because it doesn't really affect my livelihood if it doesn't work, you know? But if their colleague says, who makes a living off the farm, this really is beneficial to me, this works for me, I believe in it, they have a lot of confidence that it will also work for them.
let's go back. We talked about cover crops, but talk to me about some of the species that you found. I think you had said also that you were working specifically with legumes.
Yes. So our workhorse basically is winter rye, cereal rye. That has been our cover crop. That it is very winter hardy. It can be planted late and still basically it will still survive the winter and still grow in the spring some, even if you plant it very late. So it is very forgiving. But we have gotten also very interested in looking at other types of cover crops. We like to have a bigger repertoire. You know, diversity is a big component of this whole work. We don't only want to have very few choices of cover crops, and because only something has to happen with that particular crop or cover crop, and it could be devastating. You know, we could also select for pests or so that would be adapted to a simple cropping system, and that could become a problem. So we like to have more diversity, and I personally would really like to have more choices in the legumes because they fix nitrogen from the air. So we bring nitrogen into our cropping systems from the air around it's 80% nitrogen, but we are just not able to capture it. But those plants are. So if we fix it like that, we don't have to purchase it in a fertilizer. But the legumes, there are not as many like workhorses like rye. And so they are a little bit more sensitive to planting date. So the ones that we have looked at were our hairy vetch and crimson clover. Now, crimson clover was supposed to not be as winter hardy, and actually it was, if you look at the literature, it was supposed not to be winter hardy in Pennsylvania.
All right, so you're looking, rye is kind of your workhorse, but you're beginning to look at these other legumes as...
Well, legumes and grasses and other broadleaves.
Okay.
So we want to have a large assortment of choices.
Okay.
And so we have, we are looking at hairy vetch, we're looking at crimson clover. We've also used red clover, but red clover for planting in the fall has not been, it's slow, a little bit too slow in its growth, but it has applications. We can use a frost seeding method in small grains. In February, March, you can just broadcast the red clover seeds into a living stand of, say, wheat or barley, and it will come up underneath. And after the small grain harvest, red clover is there. Then you can let it go until next year and terminate it at that time.
Okay, so you have a small grain harvest, and then you're growing your cover crop in that understory and not affecting the harvest at all.
Oh, yeah, right.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
That's
So
pretty cool.
it's relay cropping, in fact.
Relay cropping.
Relay cropping.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah. It means planting your next crop already in the standing crop.
Okay.
And we are also, some of my colleagues are experimenting with doing that in corn as well. They've developed a special interseeder that can be used to plant a cover crop into standing corn when it is about knee high or a little bit taller. You establish already a cover crop into that standing corn, so we're looking at that as well. But so we're trying to expand the choices. We try to find legumes that can be used successfully, and to our pleasure, we have seen that, for example, crimson clover was a surprise. We've now found crimson clover or evaluated crimson clover that really does very well and performs consistently even after corn silage harvest, which came as a surprise. But it works very well. Now, we also like to mix cover crops together, not only grow one type of cover crop, but we grow different species together that complement each other. So very, very popular mix that is a newcomer, I would say, is annual ryegrass with crimson clover.
Okay.
It
Annual ryegrass.
Annual ryegrass with
Okay.
crimson clover. Yes.
And the annual ryegrass has that really good below ground root mass. Is that correct?
Yeah, if it is planted at a timely manner,
Yes.
and it grows well, it has a very good heavy root mass, very fibrous root mass. And then combined with the crimson clover, it makes a very nice combination.
And that's also a good forage for your farm.
Yes, that's especially where the farmers are interested, because it has a higher protein content than any of the other mixtures that we looked at.
Wow.
And a higher digestibility.
Okay.
Yeah, and then we're also evaluating things like triticale, which is a hybrid or a cross between wheat and rye.
Right.
Also, that can be mixed with crimson clover as well. It's also looking very good. Also has higher digestibility usually, and higher protein content than, say, rye.
Okay. So you're kind of mixing a grass and a broadleaf kind of
Yeah.
thing. Okay.
And we are also trying three-way mixes where we mix a broadleaf of, say, a brassica
Yes.
with legume and a grass.
Okay.
Yeah, we're also trying those.
So what does each one of those types of plant bring to the party? You know, you've got your grass, you've got your brassica, then you've got your legume. How do they complement one another?
Yeah, so the grasses are very aggressive growers. They produce a lot of biomass.
Yes.
They have very fibrous root systems that really help to improve the soil structures, soil aggregate stability. The legumes, they bring in nitrogen, and they have a low C/N ratio. Even though they may mature, their C/N ratio still stays low. In contrast to the grasses, they start to lignify at a certain point of time when they start to shoot the head. After that, they start to lignify more and more. The C/N ratio starts to increase, and the decomposition rate decreases. I think it also affects the biological activity, or how microbes can digest that material. Then that rate goes down.
Yes.
It becomes slower. So if we combine the grass with the legume, we can have a more active soil biology.
So that carbon can be utilized more.
Yeah. And then the brassicas, now they are not known for being mycorrhizal.
Yes.
So they don't have that association. So both of the grasses and the legumes, they also have mycorrhizal associations.
Lots and lots of these fungal hyphae all through the rhizosphere.
Yes. The brassicas don't, but they have other interesting characteristics. For example, some of the brassicas are used for biofumigation.
Like the mustards?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, they can be used for biofumigation, so they suppress certain diseases in the soil, and used for that purpose.
Any examples of biofumigation that you've seen?
Well, it is a common practice, for example, in potato production. Now, it's not very common here.
Yes.
We grow potatoes, and but the use of mustard for biofumigation, I'm not sure if it is very common, but I know in the west of the United States, where a lot of the potatoes are grown, they use brassicas for biofumigation customarily, and it replaces basically a fungicide application.
Got it.
Yeah.
What other properties do brassicas have? I heard someone describe the brassica as they were brought in 20 or 30 years ago. Someone saw them in South America being used in South America, and they sort of became the rock stars of the cover crop world.
Yeah. So another very interesting thing about the brassicas is their taproot system.
Right.
So they bring that to the table, that they make big holes basically in the soil that help with aeration and compaction alleviation.
So the sort of poster child would be something like the Daikon Radish.
Right.
Okay.
And then another thing is how the dynamics of their decomposition. It seems to really have a lot of potential for nitrogen cycling. Yeah.
Okay. So they scavenge the nitrogen.
They scavenge, are very good scavengers of nitrogen.
Okay. Then
So-
they're holding that, and just at the right time, once they're killed, they then release that, mineralize that nitrogen for the next crop.
Yes.
Okay.
And so the synchronization of that process is very important.
Okay.
For example, if we have a rye crop, cover crop, takes up a lot of nitrogen, and then it lignifies, and its C/N ratio is very high, then the nitrogen takes a long time before that is being released.
Yes.
So our next crop can actually have a nitrogen deficiency, although the rye took up 200 pounds of nitrogen from the soil,
Right.
because that nitrogen is all tied up. And when you have the brassicas, they tend to release that nitrogen very quickly. So I still remember some of the research from Brazil, for example. They showed that the brassicas in their system had a higher nitrogen fertilizer value than some of the legumes. So they could plant a corn crop after the brassica, and because that brassica has pumped nitrogen from the subsoil, we believe, and brought it to the surface, and now it decomposed quickly and released the nitrogen to the corn, it was synchronized very nicely so that the corn would really benefit from that, and the value of that nitrogen, the nitrogen value of that brassica cover crop was actually higher than that of a pea legume cover crop.
Wow. So just the scavenging value can sometimes exceed the nitrogen fixing value.
Yes.
Wow.
Mhm.
Okay, now I've learned something new again
Yeah.
today. What's your favorite? Do you have a favorite brassica then? I mean, if you were...
So the brassicas, we don't have too many choices. We have the Daikon Radish.
Yes.
I really like it. The disadvantage of it, it winter kills in our state,
Yes.
and so we don't have it grow after January. Basically, there's no growth.
Right.
It died. We have also tried rape.
Forage.
Now, rape
right,
does
yeah.
survive the winter.
Yeah.
At least it can if it is established early enough. But yeah, the forage radish, the Daikon radish, looks perhaps the most favorite one, although we have that aspect of the winter kill. But when we have high soil fertility, and on our farms that is typically common with the manure history, that Daikon radish has a lot of potential. It can suck up a lot of nitrogen and does very well, and then release it back into the soil. We like to emphasize a companion with it that is alive through the spring.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that would be...
Say rye, or what can it be? Annual ryegrass, or triticale, or usually a grass
Okay.
we like to have as a companion.